I don't know, to be honest. And she was saying, like, if it doesn't rain within, like, 5 or 6 minutes, I say we get up and start walking home quick so that we have a chance to get home before it rains. And then I was thinking it was gonna rain a lot, so I was, like, wanting to sit there and hopefully wait it out.
Were you upset with her when she was wanting to go home instead of trying to wait out the rain?
No. I just thought, I just thought we should maybe wait.
They looked like ordinary teenagers. Backpacks slung over their shoulders, quiet smiles, some even made honor roll. But behind closed doors, something unthinkable was brewing. They weren't acting out. They weren't just troubled. They were planning, calculating, and when the moment came, they crossed a line no child should ever approach. Murder. These were crimes that shocked entire communities. Victims were left lifeless, families shattered, and investigators shaken by the sheer coldness of what they discovered. Each case forced the justice system to ask a terrifying question. When the crime is that brutal, does age really matter? Tonight, we're pulling back the curtain on the most dangerous teen killers ever tried as adults. The confessions will chill you, the courtroom moments will haunt you, and the prison sentences, they're as real and as permanent as the lives they destroyed. Because sometimes, evil doesn't grow with age. Sometimes, it arrives early. Case 1. Aiden Zelmer. In the quiet town of Thornton, Colorado, June 2017 began like any other early summer month. Warm air, children on break from school, and neighborhoods settling into the rhythms of family life. But what would soon unfold there would shatter that calm and leave a community grappling with the terrifying truth that danger can come from places least expected. 10-year-old Kiaya Campbell was reported missing one evening after reportedly being caught in a rainstorm while walking with a teenage family acquaintance. Search efforts intensified overnight, with neighbors, police officers, and rescue teams working tirelessly to find the young girl. Tragically, their efforts ended the following day when her body was discovered in a drainage ditch near a nearby trail. What initially looked like a disappearance had turned into a homicide investigation, one that would soon lead authorities into chilling territory. The suspect was not a stranger, not a drifter, and not an adult with a long history of violence. It was a 15-year-old boy, someone known to the victim and trusted within the family circle. That boy was Aiden Zelmer. The psychological weight of this case sent shockwaves through law enforcement and legal circles alike. This wasn't just a case of youthful recklessness or peer pressure spiraling out of control. This was deliberate, targeted violence committed by someone barely old enough to legally drive. The investigation revealed that Zelmer had led Kiaya into a secluded area under the pretense of finding shelter from the storm, only to unleash a fatal assault. The level of planning and intent challenged every assumption about juvenile crime and the capacity for malice in someone so young. From the beginning, the legal proceedings reflected the gravity of the crime. Though Zelmer was only 15, prosecutors moved swiftly to charge him as an adult. Under Colorado law, juvenile suspects can be tried in adult court depending on the severity of the offense. And this case qualified under the most serious category: first-degree murder. The decision sparked broader conversations about juvenile justice and whether some teens are simply too dangerous to remain within the rehabilitative bounds of the juvenile system. Zelmer eventually pleaded guilty to first-degree murder. During the sentencing hearing, the courtroom was heavy with emotion. Trial testimony revealed that Zelmer had not only admitted to the crime, but showed awareness of what he had done. He was sentenced to life in prison with the possibility of parole after 40 years, a sentence that reflects the court's acknowledgement of both the severity of the crime and his status as a minor at the time it was committed. This case raises critical issues within the broader criminal justice system, particularly around the treatment of juvenile offenders who commit adult-level crimes. In the past, there's been significant debate about where the line should be drawn, when a teenager should be viewed as capable of rehabilitation, and when society must prioritize public safety over second chances. Colorado, like many other states, has laws in place that allow prosecutors to try juveniles as adults when the charges involve extreme violence or premeditation. But every time such a case arises, it reopens the conversation about how early signs of violent behavior should be addressed. Was there anything in Zelmer's background that might have predicted this act? Could intervention have changed the course of his life and Kiaya's? Experts in adolescent psychology often point out that teenage brains are still developing, especially in the areas related to impulse control, empathy, and long-term planning. However, this science is complicated when a teen commits an act that seems not only deliberate, but calculated. The case of Aiden Zelmer blurs those boundaries. It's the kind of tragedy that forces courts, communities, and families to reconsider their understanding of childhood innocence and the capacity for darkness within it. Law enforcement in this case acted swiftly and methodically. From the initial search for a missing child to the criminal investigation that followed, the process was a textbook example of procedural efficiency. Investigators relied on interviews, physical evidence, and ultimately a confession that sealed the case. But behind the headlines, officers and detectives were left grappling with the same emotional turmoil as the public. How could a 15-year-old be capable of such harm? The courtroom itself became a stage where justice, grief, and societal reflection all collided. Family members of the victim gave emotional statements. Prosecutors laid out the timeline and psychological weight of the crime. Defense attorneys attempted to paint a picture of a young person whose life might still hold value, despite the horror of what had happened. The sentencing brought closure in a legal sense, but for those closest to Kiaya, closure remains elusive. This story is more than just a crime. It's a cautionary tale about trust, warning signs, and the fragile boundaries between adolescence and accountability. It reminds us that evil doesn't always arrive in the form we expect. Sometimes, it wears the face of a teenager. In terms of public safety, the case prompts communities to re-examine how we supervise youth, the importance of mental health interventions, and how schools, families, and legal systems can work together to prevent violent escalation before it's too late. Rehabilitation remains an important goal in juvenile justice. But when a child commits a crime so heinous that it shatters the community, the system must also reflect the need for protection and justice. Zelmer will not be eligible for parole until well into his 50s. Whether he can be rehabilitated or not remains to be seen. But for the family of Kiaya Campbell, the sentence offers a measure of assurance that the person responsible will not be free for decades. It's a reminder of the balance courts must strike between acknowledging the developmental limitations of youth and protecting the community from those who have crossed a moral line from which there is no return. The legacy of this case lies in the questions it forces us to ask. How young is too young for a life sentence? Can a child who takes a life ever truly be changed? And perhaps most importantly, how can we as a society detect and intervene before tragedy strikes? These are the hard conversations the justice system continues to face. And in the case of Aiden Zelmer, the consequences of missing the warning signs will be felt for a lifetime. Case 2, Conrad Schoffer. It began in Deltona, Florida, a suburban city known more for quiet cul-de-sacs and retirement communities than the kind of violence that would soon claim headlines. In July 2013, that calm was shattered by a wave of senseless brutality. 2 people were gunned down in what initially seemed like random acts of violence. Police were stunned by the lack of motive, the chaotic nature of the shootings, and the terrifying realization that the shooter was not a hardened adult criminal, but a 15-year-old boy named Conrad Schoffer. The investigation unfolded quickly. Law enforcement agencies in Volusia County were alerted after a series of shootings took place across a 24-hour period. The first victim, 22-year-old David Guerrero, was walking to work in the early morning when he was shot and killed without provocation. Just hours later, 31-year-old U.S. Army veteran Jesse Doherty was found dead inside his own home. There was no clear connection between the victims. They had never met, and their routines did not intersect. But investigators would soon discover that these killings were not accidents, nor crimes of passion. They were cold-blooded executions committed out of boredom, thrill-seeking, and a disturbing lack of empathy. As detectives pieced together surveillance footage, eyewitness accounts, and forensic evidence, their investigation led them to an unexpected suspect, a teenage boy who had recently run away from home. Schoffer, who had a minor juvenile history at the time, was arrested along with a group of friends he had been spending time with. What emerged from the interrogation room stunned even veteran officers. Schoffer confessed to multiple shootings and admitted that he and another teen had fired at cars, pedestrians, and homes simply for amusement. The randomness was part of the plan. The violence had no purpose, except to feel something. The psychological profile behind the crime was as alarming as the acts themselves. Experts in juvenile behavior and forensic psychology noted that Schoffer exhibited traits consistent with antisocial behavior and emotional detachment. Unlike many youth offenders who commit acts of violence under duress, influence, or reactive anger, Schoffer's actions pointed to something more chilling, a capacity for calculated cruelty and a fascination with destruction. He wasn't driven by revenge or desperation. He was driven by the thrill of power and the absence of remorse. This raised serious questions within the criminal justice system. How does a 15-year-old evolve into someone capable of such deliberate violence? Was there a missed opportunity to intervene earlier? And once such a line has been crossed, can rehabilitation be a realistic goal? Or must society treat such individuals as irredeemably dangerous regardless of age? In Florida, state laws allow prosecutors to try juveniles as adults in cases involving murder or violent felonies. And that's precisely what happened in Schoffer's case. The severity of the crime left little room for leniency. Prosecutors presented a case that emphasized premeditation, intent, and the sheer disregard for human life. Trial testimony included chilling details from interviews and police reports, painting a picture of a young man who not only committed murder, but seemed eerily disconnected from the reality of what he had done. The courtroom drama unfolded with a mix of legal strategy and emotional weight. Family members of the victims sat through testimony that described how their loved ones were targeted for no reason at all. Defense attorneys attempted to highlight Schoffer's age and potential for change, pointing to his troubled home life and mental health challenges. But the prosecution argued that the calculated nature of the killings demanded adult consequences. At the conclusion of the legal proceedings, Schoffer was convicted and sentenced to multiple life terms. His sentencing hearing reflected the complexity of juvenile justice, acknowledging the tragedy of a wasted young life while still affirming society's need for accountability and protection. The sentence meant that Schoffer would spend the rest of his life behind bars, with no guarantee of parole. This case sparked broader national discussions about juvenile sentencing, mental health interventions, and the growing number of teens involved in violent, seemingly motiveless crimes. Advocates on both sides weighed in. Some argued that life sentences for minors contradict the rehabilitative goals of the juvenile justice system and fail to consider the neurological science of brain development. Others countered that certain acts of violence are so extreme that they override those considerations entirely. The tragedy of Conrad Schoffer's case is layered. On one level, it is the story of two innocent lives lost without cause. On another, it is a glimpse into the mind of a teenager whose emotional and moral development was dangerously off course. And on yet another level, it is a reflection of a society struggling to understand how to balance justice, mercy, and public safety when youth becomes a threat. Public safety takeaways from this case are significant. Communities must pay closer attention to the warning signs of emotional detachment and thrill-seeking behavior in adolescence. Early mental health evaluations, school-based behavioral interventions, and increased communication between parents, schools, and law enforcement could play a role in prevention. The system is not just reactive, it has the potential to intervene if it's resourced and empowered to do so. Law enforcement, in this case, demonstrated the critical importance of swift coordination and thorough forensic work. The investigation was methodical, combining surveillance analysis with forensic ballistics to identify the pattern behind the shootings. Officers displayed a clear commitment to solving the case with both speed and care, ensuring that no further lives were at risk. The broader criminal justice system continues to evolve in response to cases like this. The U.S. Supreme Court has issued several rulings in recent years limiting the use of mandatory life sentences for juveniles, citing the need to consider developmental factors and potential for rehabilitation. However, these decisions leave room for judicial discretion, particularly in cases that reflect extraordinary brutality or public risk. In the end, the story of Conrad Schoffer is not just about what happened on a street in Deltona, Florida. It's a mirror reflecting society's struggle to define justice when innocence is corrupted early and irrevocably. It forces uncomfortable questions. What do we do with children who kill? Can evil emerge in youth? And how do we ensure others like him are identified before they reach the point of no return? The answers aren't simple, but the urgency of asking them has never been clearer. Case 3. Russell Burrell. In the fall of 2000, the city of Providence, Rhode Island, found itself shaken by a crime so brutal, so calculated, that even veteran detectives struggled to make sense of it. The quiet hum of residential life was shattered when 3 people were found dead in a triple homicide that would not only haunt the city's memory, but also challenge the boundaries of juvenile justice. What made the case especially chilling wasn't just the number of victims, it was the age of the person responsible. At only 17 years old, Russell Burrell orchestrated and carried out a violent spree that would land him 6 consecutive life sentences and firmly cement his place in the criminal justice system as one of the most dangerous teen offenders the state had ever seen. The incident began when Burrell and several accomplices decided to commit a robbery, but the situation escalated in a direction no one anticipated. What was intended to be a theft quickly turned into a bloodbath. The victims, 2 men and a woman, were shot execution style, with little time to plead or react. The motivation behind the crime was described in court as part greed, part thrill, and part assertion of power. Yet what prosecutors and mental health professionals would later grapple with was not just what happened, but why someone so young could carry out such carnage with a chilling sense of control. The investigation began immediately. Providence police, working alongside state and federal agencies, launched a massive effort to track down the suspects. Forensics experts combed through the crime scene, gathering shell casings, DNA samples, and footprints. Witness testimony and surveillance footage played key roles in narrowing down the list of suspects, ultimately leading detectives to Burrell. The arrest sent shockwaves through the community. The young man who had once blended into the background of everyday life was now at the center of a triple homicide investigation. From the moment of his arrest, Burrell showed little emotion. Detectives involved in the case later described his demeanor as detached and cold, leading many to question what was going on beneath the surface. Was this the result of a traumatic upbringing, gang affiliation, or a deeper psychological disorder? These questions followed the case into the courtroom, where prosecutors laid out a detailed narrative of planning, intent, and ruthless execution. Burrell was charged as an adult under Rhode Island law, which allows juveniles aged 17 and older to be tried as adults in capital cases. The legal proceedings were intense. Trial testimony included witness accounts, forensic evidence, and psychological evaluations. Prosecutors painted Burrell as the ringleader, someone who not only orchestrated the killings, but carried them out with the kind of decisiveness that belied his age. The defense team, in contrast, attempted to highlight his youth, arguing that he had been influenced by older individuals and had grown up in an environment filled with instability and violence. Throughout the trial, the courtroom remained heavy with emotion. Families of the victims sat silently as the details of the crime were presented. The judge, balancing the need for justice with the complexities of trying a juvenile, acknowledged the weight of the decision. But the evidence was overwhelming. The planning, the brutality, and the leadership role Burrell had taken all pointed to a level of criminal responsibility that could not be ignored. At the sentencing hearing, Burrell was handed 6 consecutive life sentences, plus an additional 10 years. It was one of the harshest sentences ever given to someone his age in Rhode Island history. The court's decision reflected a belief that Burrell was not simply a misguided teenager, but someone who posed a lasting threat to public safety. The sentence ensured that he would never again walk free, a conclusion that brought some measure of closure to the families affected, but raised ongoing questions about youth violence and justice in America. What makes this case especially compelling in the broader context of criminal justice is how it forces a reckoning with the idea of rehabilitation. Can someone who commits such an act at 17 ever be truly changed? Should the justice system leave room for the possibility of transformation, or are some crimes too extreme to allow for second chances? These are not easy questions, and Burrell's case sits squarely at the intersection of psychology, law, and social policy. Mental health professionals who examined Burrell noted traits commonly associated with antisocial behavior, including a lack of empathy, impulsivity, and a need for control. However, there were also signs of environmental influence, exposure to violence, potential neglect, and limited access to psychological support. The complexity of his psychological profile adds to the ongoing debate about how the justice system should handle juveniles who commit adult-level crimes. Public safety is a critical takeaway from this story. It underscores the need for early intervention in communities where violence, poverty, and lack of mental health resources create a dangerous cocktail of risk factors. Schools, community centers, and social services must be empowered to identify at-risk youth before they spiral into criminal behavior. Programs focused on conflict resolution, mentorship, and trauma-informed care could serve as vital lifelines to teenagers growing up in high-stress environments. Law enforcement, in this case, demonstrated the effectiveness of thorough, collaborative investigation. The ability to gather and synthesize evidence quickly, combined with community cooperation and forensic science, helped bring a dangerous offender to justice. The swift arrest not only protected others from potential harm, but also reinforced public confidence in the justice system's ability to respond to violent crime. The case also highlights the role of trial testimony and courtroom dynamics in shaping the outcome of high-stakes cases involving juveniles. Every decision, from the charging process to the psychological evaluations presented during sentencing, played a crucial role in how the system balanced justice and due process. The sentencing hearing, in particular, was a defining moment that illustrated the tension between accountability and the possibility, however remote, of redemption. Ultimately, the story of Russell Burrell is more than just a headline about a teenager who killed. It is a reflection of how deeply complex and at times deeply broken the path to criminal behavior can be. It forces society to ask hard questions not only about punishment, but also about prevention. What could have stopped this? Who failed to intervene? And how do we prevent the next teenager from following the same path? Burrell will likely spend the rest of his life behind bars, and the lives he ended can never be restored. But if there's one enduring lesson from this tragedy, it's that early warning signs, when ignored, can erupt into devastation. The intersection of youth, violence, and justice demands more than reaction. It demands a system willing to look deeper, act sooner, and never forget what's at stake when intervention comes too late. Case 4. Thomas James Nyarho. In the early months of 2021, a deeply unsettling case unfolded in Westmoreland County, Pennsylvania. One that would shake the local community and pose difficult questions about violence, youth responsibility, and the criminal justice system's handling of adolescent offenders. It began with a single, devastating act: the fatal shooting of a 39-year-old homeless man named Eric Younger. But what gripped public attention even more than the brutality of the crime was the age of the person arrested. 15-year-old Thomas James Naros. The facts of the case emerged slowly, and the investigation took time to piece together. Law enforcement was first alerted after a passerby discovered Younger's body in a wooded area not far from Greensburg. Authorities quickly ruled the death a homicide. Evidence from the scene included shell casings, disturbed ground, and items that suggested the victim had been targeted at close range. There were no initial witnesses, no surveillance footage, and seemingly no motive. But as detectives began canvassing the area and conducting interviews, a lead began to form around one name: a local teenager known to some in the community for erratic behavior and social withdrawal. As police narrowed their focus, evidence began to mount. Investigators discovered that Naros had allegedly bragged about the shooting to others, detailing how he had lured the victim into a secluded spot. The investigation also revealed that the firearm used in the crime had been stolen from a relative's home. This new information accelerated the case, and on March 4, 2021, authorities arrested Thomas James Naros and charged him with criminal homicide. He was just 15 years old. At the center of this case was not just a tragic death, but a broader exploration into the mind of a teenager capable of premeditated violence. The psychological profile of Naros quickly became a focal point in both the legal proceedings and media coverage. Forensic evaluators were tasked with determining his mental state, capacity for remorse, and overall psychological development. According to court records, he had no significant prior record of violent behavior, but evaluators noted troubling signs of emotional detachment and a possible fascination with firearms and dominance. The shooting did not appear to stem from rage or self-defense. It appeared cold, planned, and deeply disturbing. This raised an uncomfortable but necessary question. What leads a 15-year-old to commit such a violent act against a vulnerable person? Eric Younger, the victim, was a homeless man with no documented history of threatening behavior. He had reportedly been cooperative and trusting in his final moments, making his death not just tragic, but psychologically jarring. Prosecutors faced a difficult decision: how to try a juvenile whose crime mirrored adult-level brutality. Pennsylvania, like many states, permits juvenile defendants to be tried as adults under certain conditions, especially in cases involving murder. However, after several hearings and negotiations, a plea deal was eventually reached. In 2023, Naros pleaded guilty to third-degree murder, a lesser charge that removed the possibility of life without parole. The legal proceedings revealed a combination of factors: his age, lack of prior convictions, and psychological evaluations led prosecutors to agree to a sentence that balanced accountability with the potential for rehabilitation. Under the terms of the plea agreement, Naros would serve time in a juvenile detention facility until his 21st birthday. After that, he would be transferred to an adult prison to serve the remainder of a 10 to 20-year sentence. The sentencing hearing was emotional, and both legal teams presented their final arguments. The prosecution emphasized the calculated nature of the crime, arguing that public safety demanded a strong response. The defense, while acknowledging the severity of the act, urged the court to consider Naros's young age, his capacity for change, and his willingness to accept responsibility. This case became a point of reflection for the justice system and the public. Should a teenager be held to the same standards as an adult when committing such acts? What does rehabilitation look like in a case like this? And is it possible? The courtroom drama served as a mirror reflecting the challenges of modern juvenile justice. The trial testimony and sentencing hearing underscored how difficult it is to navigate the line between punitive justice and rehabilitative potential. The fact that Naros will remain incarcerated through critical years of his development leaves open the question of whether structured intervention and psychological support can redirect the path of a youth so clearly derailed. Law enforcement in Westmoreland County was praised for the precision of the investigation. Officers moved carefully to collect evidence, preserve the integrity of the case, and pursue leads without rushing to judgment. The investigative process highlighted the importance of community cooperation and forensic analysis in resolving cases involving juvenile suspects. But even as the legal case reached its conclusion, the emotional scars left behind, both for the victim's family and the defendants, remained painfully open. There are valuable public safety lessons to be learned from this case. Early behavioral intervention in schools, increased access to adolescent mental health resources, and secure firearm storage in homes are all key components of prevention. The gun used in the crime had been stolen from a family member's house, underscoring a repeated pattern in youth violence cases. Access to unsecured weapons and lack of parental awareness. The story of Thomas James Naros forces society to confront a reality many would prefer to ignore. Some young people commit horrific crimes not because they are forced to, but because something inside them has already fractured. The challenge, then, becomes recognizing those fractures early enough to act and building systems capable of doing more than simply reacting once the damage is done. Rehabilitation remains a long and uncertain road for Naros. He will spend his formative years in the custody of the state. Whether that time will be used for true psychological development, educational opportunity, and restorative growth depends as much on the system as it does on him. The justice system has given him a sentence that offers both punishment and the potential for transformation. What he does with that opportunity remains to be seen. Meanwhile, the memory of Eric Younger, his life, his struggles, and his tragic end remains central to the heart of this story. In the aftermath of violence, justice seeks to provide resolution, but never forgets the lives it couldn't save. Ultimately, the case of Thomas James Naros is more than a legal episode. It is a warning, a reflection, and a challenge to a society that must continuously examine how it raises, educates, and protects its youth, while also safeguarding its most vulnerable. The balance between justice and redemption is delicate, and in cases like this, every decision, every outcome ripples far beyond the courtroom. Case 5, Logan Tyler Mott. In November 2017, a case unfolded in Jacksonville, Florida, that would stun even the most seasoned law enforcement officers. A grandmother was reported missing from her Neptune Beach home, and her 15-year-old grandson, Logan Tyler Mott, had vanished along with her car and a stash of firearms. The initial concern was confusion. Perhaps a runaway, a domestic misunderstanding, or a missing persons report that would quickly be resolved. But what began as a family concern would evolve into a high-profile criminal investigation involving border agents, international law enforcement, and a chilling revelation that left a community searching for answers. Christina French was a 53-year-old woman deeply devoted to her family. She was helping raise her grandson, while his father, a corrections officer, was away on a trip. By all accounts, Christina was nurturing, responsible, and structured. She lived with Logan part-time and was often responsible for his care. But what no one expected was that this domestic arrangement, built on love and trust, would unravel in a violent act that would ultimately cost her life and send Logan Mott down a path from high school student to convicted murderer. When French failed to show up for work and family members couldn't reach her, local police were contacted. Officers conducted a welfare check at the home and found signs that something was terribly wrong. The house appeared ransacked, and a pungent odor suggested something far more sinister than a simple runaway scenario. An investigation was launched immediately. Detectives quickly discovered that Logan and his grandmother were missing, and the home's firearms were unaccounted for. Surveillance footage showed Logan driving French's vehicle, and within hours, law enforcement had issued an alert across multiple counties. As the manhunt expanded, the story took a sudden turn. Authorities discovered that Logan had crossed into Canada at the Buffalo border using his grandmother's vehicle. When Canadian officials apprehended him, he was alone. Inside the car were guns and traces of what appeared to be blood evidence. He was detained and returned to the United States shortly thereafter. Back in Florida, investigators uncovered Christina French's body buried in a shallow grave in the backyard of the Neptune Beach property. The autopsy revealed that she had been shot and stabbed multiple times. While the physical evidence was damning, it was the psychological undercurrent of the case that raised deeper questions. What had driven a seemingly ordinary 15-year-old to commit such a calculated and brutal crime against someone he loved? During the investigation, authorities explored Logan's background in depth. By many accounts, he was intelligent, quiet, and not outwardly violent. He played in the school band and was described as having a good demeanor by teachers. But there were also reports of emotional instability. He had struggled with behavioral issues, had frequent conflicts with authority figures, and may have harbored resentment toward his home life. Detectives and psychologists working the case began to develop a psychological profile, noting a pattern of suppressed emotion, lack of coping skills, and a tendency toward internalized rage. The criminal justice system faced a profound decision: whether to try Logan as a juvenile or an adult. The severity of the crime, combined with the evidence of premeditation and the attempt to flee internationally, left little room for leniency. Prosecutors charged Logan Mott as an adult, despite his age, and the legal proceedings began to unfold in a Florida courtroom. Logan initially pleaded not guilty, but later accepted a plea agreement. In 2021, during a sentencing hearing that drew significant attention, he pleaded guilty to the murder of his grandmother. The courtroom atmosphere was thick with tension and heartbreak. Trial testimony recounted the timeline of events leading up to the murder, the physical evidence collected, and the emotional impact on surviving family members. The judge handed down a life sentence with eligibility for parole after 25 years, a term that reflects Florida's evolving approach to juvenile justice while still acknowledging the gravity of the crime. The sentencing hearing was a pivotal moment, not only for the family, but for broader conversations about youth violence, rehabilitation, and the limits of the justice system. The judge, in delivering the sentence, remarked on the devastating betrayal of trust that defined this case. The courtroom became a space where grief, accountability, and policy intersected. The case of Logan Mott exposes several critical failures in public safety systems and mental health intervention. Despite being in a relatively stable home environment, early warning signs of emotional disturbance appear to have gone unaddressed. Experts argue that better access to adolescent counseling, family therapy, and structured behavioral interventions might have mitigated the buildup of emotional tension that ultimately exploded into violence. While not every tragic case is preventable, this one underscores the importance of recognizing when a teen is quietly unraveling. Law enforcement's response was widely praised. The investigation was swift, methodical, and grounded in interagency cooperation. Detectives from Neptune Beach worked in tandem with federal officials, the Department of Homeland Security, and Canadian authorities to bring Logan back into custody. The forensic investigation, digital tracking, and behavioral analysis combined to form a thorough and effective case. Yet, the most unsettling aspect of this story remains psychological. What makes a teenager capable of such a crime, and why against someone who had raised him? Theories vary. Some point to suppressed trauma, others to untreated mental illness, and still others to a volatile mix of impulsivity and underdeveloped emotional control. The adolescent brain, as countless studies suggest, is still forming critical neural connections related to empathy, judgment, and moral reasoning. But the presence of opportunity, access to weapons, and a breakdown in familial trust created a perfect storm in Logan's case. His life sentence includes the possibility of parole, meaning there is still a sliver of hope for rehabilitation. But the road ahead is uncertain. Whether Logan can come to terms with what he did, whether he can evolve into someone capable of remorse and transformation, remains an open question. This case serves as a stark reminder that the most dangerous crimes can occur not in back alleys or isolated streets, but within the very homes meant to offer safety and love. It underscores the importance of communication between teens and caregivers, the early detection of behavioral shifts, and the crucial role of mental health support in the lives of vulnerable adolescents. In the end, Logan Tyler Mott will spend much of his life behind bars. But what he left behind, a shattered family, a devastated community, and the unanswered questions of how this could happen, will linger long after the courtroom doors have closed. The legal system rendered its verdict, but the deeper challenge lies in understanding the mind of a teenager who chose to destroy the very person who gave him everything. Case 6, John Freeman Jr. In the summer of 2012, the quiet streets of Niagara Falls, New York, were pierced by tragedy. A family entrusted their 5-year-old to a teenage babysitter believed to be responsible and safe. Instead, the young girl, Isabella Tennant, never returned home. What began as a routine overnight stay evolved into a heartbreaking investigation that would raise difficult questions about youth, trust, and the limits of the justice system. The investigation launched immediately after Isabella's great-grandmother noticed her absence the following morning. Law enforcement arrived at the home and began piecing together a distressing scene. Isabella was missing, and the babysitter, John Freeman Jr., was no longer at the house. Surveillance and interviews led detectives on a relentless search through the neighborhood, eventually recovering Isabella's body in a garbage container a few blocks away. Evidence indicated she had been strangled and that Freeman had attempted to conceal the crime by disposing of the body. Within days, he was arrested and charged as an adult with second-degree murder and evidence tampering. At just 16 years old, Freeman became the face of one of the most disturbing juvenile homicide cases in Western New York in years. Psychological experts were brought in to evaluate his mental state, motivations, and capacity for remorse. The efforts at building a psychological profile revealed a deeply troubling landscape, an adolescent whose actions betrayed a chilling lack of empathy and control. Unlike impulsive or reactive juvenile offenders, Freeman's behavior showed signs of planning and concealment, indicators that challenged assumptions about the rehabilitative potential of youthful criminals. Legal proceedings unfolded with intensity and complexity. Prosecutors, supported by trial testimony from investigators and forensic analysts, painted a picture of premeditated violence. They demonstrated how Freeman had removed himself from duty, carried out the act, and attempted to hide Isabella's body. Defense counsel, while acknowledging the tragic outcome, emphasized his age and potential for change through rehabilitation, arguing that life behind bars for a teenager raised ethical concerns about lifelong punishment for youthful mistakes. Despite that, the prosecution's narrative of cold calculation left little room for leniency. The courtroom drama was deepened by emotional testimony from Isabella's family. Their grief remained palpable throughout legal proceedings. The judge presided over sentencing with the weight of both tragic loss and policy implications. Ultimately, Freeman pleaded guilty in July 2013 to second-degree murder and evidence tampering, accepting responsibility for Isabella's death, but avoiding trial testimony that might have exposed more psychological detail. Following the plea, the sentencing hearing became a pivotal moment. The judge, balancing legal standards with public safety, handed Freeman a sentence of 22 years to life. At 16, he would be tried and sentenced as an adult, a legal outcome that reflected society's judgment that some acts transcend age. While the sentence acknowledges legal responsibility and offers a path to parole decades down the line, it also raises hard questions. Can a sentence so severe ever allow room for rehabilitation? Was justice served, or did the tragedy of one act eclipse the chance for redemption? This case underscores broader tension within the criminal justice system between punishment and rehabilitation. Psychological research shows teenage brains are still forming critical pathways in the prefrontal cortex, areas linked to impulse control, moral reasoning, and empathy. Yet John Freeman's behavior indicated not an emotional outburst, but a level of deliberation and intent inconsistent with impulsive juvenile conduct. He represented a case where development and accountability collide sharply. Public safety takeaways from the case demand attention. First, the importance of caregiver responsibility and vetting is clear. A neighbor with access to firearms or emotional instability should never be alone in charge of a vulnerable child. Second, the case highlights the need for early mental health intervention, even in teens without a documented history of violence. Warning signs such as social withdrawal, fascination with control, or emotional detachment should prompt timely assessment. Third, it reinforces how rapid, methodical law enforcement investigation can prevent additional harm. Police acted quickly to secure records, analyze digital data, and collaborate with forensic experts to resolve the case without delay. Law enforcement earned commendations for the thoroughness of their work. With limited initial leads, investigators focused on neighborhood canvassing, witness interviews, and forensic reconstruction. The evidence chain, from discovery to arrest to prosecution, illustrates a textbook investigation and case-building process. The speed and accuracy of the response likely prevented further tragedy and gave the trial structure essential credibility. What makes this case especially enduring is the psychological complexity at its core. A teenager entrusted with care became the perpetrator of violence. Experts questioned whether underlying mental health issues, identity struggles, or untreated trauma may have influenced his behavior. The transition from babysitter to convicted killer underscores how early adult roles can mask inner turmoil, especially when institutions fail to provide support. In terms of criminal justice reform, Freeman's case reveals the challenges of treating juvenile offenders who commit serious crimes. State statutes allow juveniles to be tried as adults in homicide cases, but critics argue such laws undermine the rehabilitative ethos of juvenile courts. The decision to sentence Freeman as an adult reflects a system increasingly grappling with where lines should be drawn when youth crosses into violence, but also whether neuroscience should influence sentencing policy more strongly in the future. Rehabilitation in such cases is always uncertain. A life sentence with parole eligibility offers the possibility, but not the guarantee, of transformation. Whether Freeman can engage in educational programs, psychological counseling, or restorative justice remains uncertain. The prison environment, particularly for an inmate starting at such a young age, can either break or build. Society must ask, are we willing to support effective rehabilitation even for those who have committed the most heinous crimes? The legacy of this case lingers. Isabella Tennant's brief life continues to inspire public safety initiatives, reminding families never to underestimate the importance of supervision, communication, and institutional vigilance. For legal professionals, the case serves as a study in balancing psychological understanding with legal responsibility. For policymakers, it highlights the perennial question: when a juvenile commits a criminal act that shatters innocence, do we focus solely on punishment or consider prevention, intervention, and redemption as well? In the end, John Freeman Jr. is serving 22 years to life, a term that may span decades before parole is even considered. His case is recorded in public records, news archives, and court documents as one of New York's most tragic juvenile homicides. But beyond statistics, it's a human story layered with grief, complexity, and the struggle of a justice system to balance empathy and accountability. And for every minute of courtroom testimony, there are lingering questions still without clear answers about whether early warning signs could have prevented one of the most devastating failures of trust, and how we might avoid repeating the same mistakes in the future. Case 7. Dylan Shoemaker. In March 2013, a Springville household was forever changed when a seemingly ordinary evening devolved into unspeakable tragedy. 16-year-old Dylan Shoemaker had agreed to babysit his girlfriend's toddler son, 23-month-old Austin Smith, while she worked. But what unfolded was an unthinkable act of violence that would fracture trust, challenge legal boundaries, and leave a community searching for answers. Local law enforcement launched an urgent investigation after Austin was found lifeless in Shoemaker's care. The scene unfolded slowly. First responders arrived and began to notice injuries inconsistent with an accidental fall. As forensic analysis progressed, it became clear this was no tragic accident. Evidence indicated blunt force trauma to the toddler's head, not a minor incident, but a deliberate act that cut his life tragically short. Within hours, Shoemaker was charged with second-degree murder and evidence tampering, facing the maximum possible penalty of 25 years to life in prison. During the legal proceedings, prosecutors emphasized the severity and deliberateness of the act. They outlined how Shoemaker muffled the toddler's face with a pillow, struck repeatedly, and tried to disguise the violence as an accident during a 911 call. Testimony revealed that he appeared more distressed about his own fate than about the child's death. A detail prosecutors argued suggested a calculated attempt to manipulate the system. In contrast, Shoemaker's defense argued he was overwhelmed by youth, immaturity, and emotional instability. His attorneys pointed to his lack of prior criminal record and the psychological factors that distinguish adolescent behavior from adult criminal intent. They urged the court to weigh his potential for rehabilitation and the neurological science, indicating that teenage brains, still developing executive functions like empathy and impulse control, often make decisions they later regret. Despite these arguments, the jury and presiding judge were convinced the crime fell outside the scope of youthful misjudgment. In December 2013, Shoemaker was convicted of second-degree murder by a jury and sentenced in January 2014 to the maximum term, 25 years to life in prison. State Supreme Court Justice M. William Ballard described him in court as a manipulator and deceiver who showed no genuine remorse, reinforcing the court's belief in holding him accountable as an adult. The sentencing hearing served as more than just punishment. It functioned as a societal statement. The judge acknowledged both the tragedy of a child's death and the guided risk posed by a teen who not only crossed moral lines, but attempted to conceal the act. While there was acknowledgement of his age, the brutality, intent, and manipulation factors weighed heavily in ensuring the sentence left little room for reinterpretation. The psychological profile built around this case exposed uncomfortable realities. Unlike reactive teenage crimes driven by peer influence or rage, Shoemaker's behavior suggested planning and emotional detachment. Experts noted patterns consistent with antisocial traits, lack of empathy, disregard for human life, and an apparent focus on self-preservation even in the aftermath. One recorded statement where he mused that all I have to do is cry and people would feel sorry for him became emblematic of a mindset disconnected from the irreversible harm he caused. This case exposes broader tensions in the criminal justice system around how to treat juvenile offenders who commit adult-level crimes. On one hand, neuroscience research supports the theory that young brains are malleable and deserve opportunities for redemption. On the other, extreme acts of violence challenge those ideals. Shoemaker's sentencing demonstrates where the system draws a line, when premeditation, manipulation, and irreversible harm converge. Society opts for adult accountability, though not always without debate. This case underscores the imperative vetting of teen caregivers. A teenager, regardless of relationship or age, must never be placed in charge of a vulnerable child without guarantees of maturity and psychological stability. Second, it highlights the need for early mental health intervention. Shoemaker had no public history of violence, yet his behavior changed profoundly. Schools and communities must have pathways to identify emotional instability and intervene before escalation. Law enforcement's methodical response is also a vital takeaway. The case advanced due to careful forensic analysis, immediate evidence preservation, neighborhood interviews, and the critical recording of Shoemaker's 911 call. Investigators acted swiftly to assemble a case that left little ambiguity, ensuring justice moved forward with clarity and credibility. The case also illustrates the complexities of trial testimony, where both legal sides brought forth evidence about intent, emotional capacity, and moral responsibility. While remorse is a mitigating factor in many cases, Shoemaker's lack of authentic empathy became central to the court's rejection of leniency. Looking beyond the courtroom, the public discussion around Shoemaker's case reflects broader societal questions. When a teenager commits a crime this severe, how much weight should age carry? Should a life sentence ever be imposed on a minor? Is the goal of rehabilitation realistic when manipulation and detachment are evident? In 2016, appellate courts considered reducing his term based on age and mental health factors, eventually allowing him to apply for parole after 18 years. But even then, safeguards were placed. Should parole ever be granted, strict supervision would follow. The core of the case remained unchanged. A young teenager was judged capable of intentional violence and sentenced accordingly. Today, Shoemaker remains incarcerated. His case remains in the public record as a chilling study of youth violence at its worst and a legal precedent for how the justice system handles extreme juvenile offenders. It is often cited in academic discussions about juvenile justice, sentencing policy, and whether brain science should alter legal boundaries. At its heart, this story is a cautionary tale layered with sorrow, shock, and reflection. A toddler's life ended far too soon. A teenager's fate made to serve decades for choices that few believed he fully understood. And a community's trust betrayed by someone they believed played the role of protector. It remains a stark illustration that innocence, once broken, may never be reclaimed, and that when youth turns violent, the justice system may have no choice but to respond with adult severity. The ultimate question remains, can someone who commits such an irreversible act at 16 ever find redemption behind bars? Or will the system always view accountability as the only realistic path forward? Case 8. Philip Chisum. In October 2013, Danvers High School in Massachusetts became the scene of an unthinkable tragedy. 14-year-old Philip Chisum, a freshman student, attacked his math teacher, 24-year-old Colleen Ritzer, in a second-floor bathroom. This act would catalyze one of the most scrutinized juvenile murder cases in recent history. It wasn't just the gravity of the crime that shocked people. It was the age of the perpetrator and the disturbing calculatedness of what he did. The investigation into Ms. Ritzer's disappearance began after she failed to leave school at the end of the day. A search led authorities into the woods behind the school, where her body was found concealed in a recycling bin. Surveillance footage played a key role, showing Chisum trailing Ms. Ritzer into the bathroom, carrying gloves and a box cutter, later returning in a clean sweatshirt, rolling the bin into the woods, and using her credit cards to make purchases. When confronted by police, he reportedly stated simply, "She's buried." This comprehensive collection of forensic evidence and digital tracking quickly established a narrative of premeditation and emotional detachment. Psychiatrists and forensic experts were brought in to build a psychological profile of Chisum. Defense attorneys argued that he had experienced psychosis since childhood, hearing voices that compelled his actions. MRI scans were said to suggest structural brain anomalies, and family members testified to sudden behavioral changes. The prosecution, however, emphasized that the act was deliberate and controlled. Gloves used at the crime scene, concealment of evidence, and use of Ritzer's belongings all pointed to awareness and intention. The court limited much of the mental illness evidence, ruling it too speculative, a decision later upheld by the Massachusetts Supreme Judicial Court. Legal proceedings ensued in late 2015, with prosecutors presenting testimony from forensic analysts, surveillance experts, and witnesses recounting Chisum's behavior. The defense highlighted adolescent neurological immaturity and mental health factors, seeking a rehabilitative rather than entirely punitive approach. But the prosecution underscored that this crime was not impulsive teenage violence. It was a carefully executed act of extreme cruelty, showing manipulation and absence of remorse. By December 2015, the jury found Chisum guilty of first-degree murder, aggravated rape, and armed robbery. The sentencing hearing in February 2016 was emotionally charged. Judge David Lowy described the acts as brutal and senseless, noting the permanence of the devastation left in Colleen Ritzer's wake. While the murder conviction carried life with parole possibility after 25 years, Chisum also received a concurrent 40-year sentence for rape and robbery, effectively denying him parole eligibility until age 54. Victim impact statements echoed that Chisum was pure evil and undeserving of release. Chisum's legal team appealed, arguing that exclusion of psychiatric evidence and combined sentencing structure violated constitutional standards. They cited Article 26 of the Massachusetts Constitution, questioning whether the cumulative sentence system shocked the conscience. But in February 2025, the Supreme Judicial Court unanimously upheld the original verdict and sentencing. The court ruled that judicial emotion did not override legal standard and that the jury had sufficient information to weigh intent and culpability. Chisum's request for a new trial or reduced sentence was denied. This case forced a national reckoning about juvenile justice. Modern neuroscience affirms that adolescent brains are still developing areas critical to impulse control and moral reasoning, supporting rehabilitation-focused systems. However, the legal system draws a boundary when violence is calculated, controlled, and horrific in scale. Chisum's actions were interpreted not as a biological lapse, but as deliberate moral failure, a line where criminal intent overtakes developmental arguments. From a public safety perspective, the case highlights the importance of early detection of behavioral red flags, withdrawal from peers, fascination with weapons, abrupt personality shifts. Schools must prioritize mental health screenings and threat assessment protocols. Equally, law enforcement agencies need protocols for swift evidence collection, digital evidence preservation, and collaboration with forensic specialists. The seamless coordination in Chisum's case, school security footage, credit card trails, witness statements, demonstrated high professional standard in closing the case swiftly and credibly. This story also underlined courtroom dynamics that define juvenile homicide cases. Expert witnesses are battlegrounds. Prosecution experts minimized youthful impulse theory, while defense experts emphasized developmental factors. Jury deliberations had to balance the moral horror of the crime with scientific understanding of adolescent psychology. The appellate review reaffirmed that Massachusetts law supports such balancing, even if the outcome limits parole viability. Rehabilitation remains theoretically available. While Chisum's parole eligibility is set decades away, statutes allow for programming, educational opportunities, and restorative interventions in prison. Whether Chisum engages with these options remains unclear. Many argue that without admission of remorse or insight into what drove the crime, rehabilitation becomes exceptionally challenging, especially given his subsequent violent assault on a juvenile detention counselor in 2014, leading to an additional 17 to 20-year sentence to run concurrent with the original term. Ultimately, Philip Chisum's path from a 14-year-old student to a convict serving decades before parole serves as a cautionary tale about the intersection of youth, violence, and justice. It underscores how adolescent mental health crises, when left undetected or untreated, can escalate catastrophically. It shows that while systems of juvenile justice aim to rehabilitate, some acts provoke societal demands for closure and protection over rehabilitation. The case remains legally significant, educationally profound, and socially troubling. It asks difficult questions. Should developmental science ever override evidence of intent? Can someone who commits such deliberate violence at 14 ever truly reform? And how do communities balance empathy for youth against the imperative to protect? As systems evolve, Chisum's case will continue to be studied in criminal justice programs, juvenile sentencing law reviews, and public policy debates, highlighting the enduring tension between rehabilitation and accountability. And for the Hathorne High alumna who fell victim, Colleen Ritzer's memory continues to stand as a testament to quiet heroism, reminding us all that some tragedies leave wounds, communities struggle to heal. If these stories made you question what a young mind is truly capable of, if they unsettled you, gripped you, or forced you to reconsider the line between childhood and criminal intent, then hit that subscribe button and become part of the Mindframe True Crimes family. Every week, we step inside the minds of those society never expected to break: teens, children, and those who grew up behind bars. We investigate the overlooked warning signs, the courtroom decisions that shape lives, and the psychological shadows most people refuse to acknowledge. And now the Mindframe True Crimes community is officially live. Join today for exclusive member benefits, including loyalty badges, early access to videos, priority replies, member shoutouts, and more. Whether you're here to explore justice, psychology, or the dark corners no one dares to talk about, you belong here. To all my loyal subscribers and returning viewers, thank you for keeping your mind in the frame. You're the heartbeat of this channel, and your curiosity keeps these stories alive. Stay safe, stay vigilant, and remember, the mind is the most dangerous place of all. This is Mindframe True Crimes. Until next time.